They erased his name, buried his past, and made sure the world would never know his story. But Keanu Reeves? He never forgot. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to know. And while you're here, don't forget to like the video, share it with your loved ones, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that will leave you speechless. Now let's get into it. For 40 years, a single moment haunted him. The night a faceless hero saved his life. No records, no witnesses, just a cryptic name whispered in the dark, Shadow One. Now, standing at the gates of Hollywood's most powerful security agency, Keanu had one mission: to find the man who saved him. And what he uncovered was more dangerous than he ever imagined. It was supposed to be just another afternoon. Agents filed reports, security monitors flickered, and high-ranking officials discussed classified matters. Then, without warning, the heavy steel doors swung open. Keanu Reeves walked in, unannounced, unescorted, and determined. Conversations died, hands froze over keyboards, and every eye turned toward him. A voice finally broke the silence. "Mr. Reeves, what brings you here?" Keanu's expression was unwavering. "I'm looking for someone." His voice carried through the room, steady and absolute. "A man who saved my life. A man who doesn't exist anymore." Keanu Reeves had faced many challenges in his life, demanding film shoots that pushed his body to the limits, grueling stunt training for the action roles that made him a legend, personal tragedies that left wounds deeper than any Hollywood betrayal. But this was different. This wasn't about a role. This wasn't about make-believe heroics on the silver screen. This was about a man who had saved his life and then vanished. Keanu had spent decades trying to push the memory aside, telling himself that maybe it didn't matter, that maybe it was just a strange twist of fate. But no matter how many years passed, the questions remained. Who was he? Why had he disappeared? And most importantly, who made him disappear? Hollywood was a place where secrets didn't stay buried unless someone wanted them buried. And Keanu had a feeling this was one of those secrets. Now, standing inside the headquarters of Hollywood's most powerful security division, he was finally ready to get answers. The moment Keanu stepped inside, the air in the surveillance control room changed. It was the kind of place where whispers became orders, and orders became law. Huge monitors displayed real-time feeds from Hollywood's biggest studios, elite celebrity residences, and confidential files that the outside world would never see. Agents sat at terminals reviewing reports, monitoring the unseen pulse of power that ran through the city. Until now, because now they had all stopped. Every eye in the room had turned toward him. They weren't used to intrusions, not from someone like him. A flicker of surprise passed through some of their expressions, but no one spoke, no one dared. Then a voice cut through the silence. Jonathan Reyes, the man who oversaw Hollywood's most classified security operations, and thus the search for truth had only just begun. He was a ghost of his own kind, a man whose name had never been printed in the press, but whose decisions could shape an empire. With a chiseled face and cold, calculating eyes, he stepped forward, exuding an aura of authority that could freeze lesser men in place. But Keanu wasn't just anyone. Reyes studied him for a moment, then spoke. His voice was measured, deliberate. "Mr. Reeves, you're saying an agent saved you?" Keanu didn't blink, didn't waver. "Not just any agent," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "A ghost." Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly. "A ghost?" Keanu nodded. "A man who should have been remembered, but was erased instead." The words hung in the air like a challenge. They dared someone, anyone, to deny what he was saying, but no one did. The room's tension thickened, an unspoken unease settling over the agents. A few exchanged glances. Others shifted in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable. Reyes exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against his folded arms. "And you want to know why?" Keanu's jaw tightened. "I need to know why." Because the deeper he thought about that night, the way the man fought with precision, the way he vanished before anyone could get a clear look at him, the way not a single record of him existed, the more one terrifying realization set in. This wasn't just a random act of heroism. This was a cover-up, and someone had worked very, very hard to make sure the truth never surfaced. A slow murmur rippled through the agents. It wasn't loud, but it was there. The sound of people beginning to sense the weight of something bigger, something dangerous. Reyes noticed it too. His face remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't doubt, it was recognition. As if he had heard of something like this before, or worse, had been told never to speak of it. And then for the first time, there was something else in his voice, something Keanu hadn't expected, a hint of unease. Tell me everything you remember. It was spoken like a demand, but Keanu recognized the hesitation in it. Reyes wanted to know, but he was also afraid of what the answer might be. Keanu didn't hesitate. It was the early 90s, Keanu began. His voice was quiet but firm. My career was just taking off. I thought success meant red carpets, cameras flashing in my face, and headlines with my name in bold letters. He exhaled, his expression darkening. I was so caught up in that world, I didn't even see the danger creeping in. The room was completely still. No one dared to interrupt. Then a voice cut through the silence. Keanu continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of memory. We were shooting a late-night scene in a backlot outside Los Angeles. It was supposed to be routine, finish a few takes, head home. But I was exhausted. The set was nearly empty when I left. Then his gaze sharpened, and that's when I saw them. His hands curled slightly into fists, as if his body remembered the fear even if his mind had tried to suppress it. At first I thought they were fans, or maybe paparazzi. But then I noticed something off. His voice lowered, the weight of his words thick in the air. They weren't there for a photo. They weren't holding cameras. Keanu paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. They were waiting for me. Several agents shifted uneasily. Reyes's sharp gaze flickered with something unreadable. Before I could react, they surrounded me. Their movements were too smooth, too practiced. One reached for my jacket, another grabbed my arm. His jaw clenched. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with some random group of troublemakers. The room felt colder now. Keanu let the silence hang for a moment. Then his next words sent chills through everyone present. They were professionals, and they wanted me gone. Someone sucked in a breath. Reyes's jaw tightened slightly. And then, Keanu's voice softened, but the intensity in his eyes remained. That's when he appeared. The agents listening felt a shift in the air, a strange, indescribable tension. They knew who he meant. A man stepped out of the shadows. He didn't hesitate. He took them on, alone. Keanu exhaled, his voice dropping even lower. And then, he was gone. Silence, total, absolute silence. Finally, Reyes spoke again, his tone cautious. And you never found out who he was? Keanu shook his head. I tried. No name, no records. It was as if he had never existed. Reyes's gaze darkened. Then, he turned to his team. Pull every off-the-books file, deep cover operatives, retired agents. I want every trace of every shadow operative we've ever had. Keanu watched as agents began typing furiously into databases, whispering amongst themselves. The search had begun. But deep in his gut, Keanu already knew the truth. This wasn't just about finding a man. This was about uncovering something no one wanted to be found. And now there was no turning back. And so in the gathering darkness, their pursuit of the ghost would redefine everything. The air inside Hollywood's most elite security headquarters had shifted. It wasn't just a reaction to Keanu's words. It was something deeper, a quiet tension, a barely perceptible change in the atmosphere. The kind that happens when someone says something they weren't supposed to know. Keanu had seen it before, in interviews, in movie meetings, in places where power didn't like being challenged. But this was different. The room was too still, the kind of stillness that meant the people in it had heard something dangerous. Reyes, standing at the center of it all, studied Keanu with an unreadable expression. Arms crossed, posture firm, but his gaze calculating. His years of experience told him one thing. People don't just vanish. When someone disappears this thoroughly, it isn't by accident. It's because someone powerful wanted them gone. Finally, Reyes turned to his team. His voice was sharp, commanding. Pull every off-the-books file. Check retired agents, deep cover operatives, erased records. Find me something. There was a moment of hesitation. A few of the agents exchanged uneasy glances, because even suggesting digging into erased files was risky. But this wasn't just anyone asking. This was Keanu Reeves. And from the look in his eyes, they knew he wasn't leaving without answers. The hum of keyboards filled the room. Lines of encrypted data flickered across monitor after monitor as agents dug into hidden archives, bypassing clearance levels that had remained untouched for years. The hours stretched. Nothing. No name, no record, no trace of a man who had once stood in front of Keanu, risked his life, and then disappeared as if he had never existed. The silence grew heavier. Keanu felt it too. Whoever had erased this man hadn't just hidden him. They had buried him so deep, he was never meant to be found. Then, A sudden alert flashed on one of the screens. An agent stiffened, a flicker of hesitation. Keanu saw it. Reyes noticed it too. He stepped forward, his voice even. "What did you find?" The agent swallowed. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally spoke. A single, unmarked file. No official designation, no department listed, just one name buried deep within an old intelligence archive. Michael Hayes. Reyes narrowed his eyes. Hayes was a covert operative, but he went dark years ago, vanished, just like your guy. Keanu didn't hesitate. Where is he now? One of the agents pulled up an address, a small, isolated house in Virginia. Then a voice cut through the silence. Reyes exhaled, rubbing his temples. This guy isn't going to talk easily. Keanu's jaw tightened. Then we make him. The next morning, Keanu and Reyes drove through the old, desolate Virginia countryside. The road stretched endlessly before them, winding through empty fields. The air was crisp, but the silence between them was sharper. The weight of what they were about to uncover hung over them. The address led them to the end of a lonely dirt road, where a weathered, unassuming house stood. No neighbors, no cars in the driveway, no signs of life, just silence. Reyes parked, gripping the wheel for a moment before glancing at Keanu. "Last chance," he said. "Once we knock, there's no going back." Keanu unbuckled his seatbelt, his expression unwavering. "I've waited 40 years for answers. I'm not stopping now." They stepped out of the car and approached the door. Keanu knocked. Once, silence. Twice, nothing. A third time, still nothing. Then a voice from inside, raspy, worn, but firm. "Go away." Keanu exchanged glances with Reyes before speaking, his voice calm but resolute. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just need information." Another beat of silence. Then the soft click of a lock. The door cracked open slightly, revealing Michael Hayes. Hayes was older now. His face was lined, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes, still sharp, still cautious, the look of a man who had spent too many years looking over his shoulder. His gaze flickered to Keanu. Recognition flashed in his expression. Then something else. Regret. "You should have left this alone." His voice was rough, like a man who had spent years speaking in whispers. Reyes kept his tone steady. "Tell us the truth." For a moment, it seemed like Hayes would shut the door in their faces. But then, he stepped aside. A silent invitation. A signal that he had been waiting for this moment too. Inside, the house felt less like a home and more like a vault of forgotten secrets. Stacks of old files, yellowed documents, and faded photographs covered every surface. A fortress built from history. Keanu's eyes scanned the room until he saw it. A grainy black and white photograph pinned to the wall. A group of men stood in covert tactical gear, faces hardened, expressions unreadable. But one man stood apart, his stance rigid, his eyes piercing, watching something beyond the frame. Like he was aware that, even in that moment, he was being hunted. Below the image, a name scrawled in fading ink. David Cole. Keanu's heart pounded. "Is this him?" Hayes exhaled slowly. "That's him." His voice was barely above a whisper. David Cole, but he wasn't just an agent. Keanu turned to him. Then what was he? Hayes hesitated. Then he reached under his desk, pulling out an old metal box. He flipped it open, revealing dozens of classified documents. Each one marked confidential, classified, for authorized eyes only. Hayes tapped the files. David Cole wasn't just an agent. He was a deep cover operative. He infiltrated organizations that no one else could get close to. Reyes frowned. "What kind of organizations?" Hayes' voice dropped to a whisper. "The kind that control everything." Keanu's expression darkened. "And what happened to him?" Hayes let out a quiet laugh. "He got too close. He uncovered something bigger than any of us. And the second he tried to expose it, they wiped him out of existence." The room was silent. Keanu stared at the faded photograph. For 40 years, he had searched for this man. And now he was closer than ever. "Where is he now?" Keanu's voice was quiet, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Hayes hesitated. "If he's still alive, he doesn't want to be found. Or someone made sure he never would be." Reyes glanced at Keanu. They both knew what had to happen next. They had to find David Cole. And for the first time, Keanu realized he wasn't just chasing the past. He was walking into a war. The cabin was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that weighed heavy, pressing against the walls like a secret waiting to be spoken. The moment Keanu locked eyes with David Cole, time seemed to slow. For 4 decades, this moment had haunted him. The night when a stranger had risked everything to save his life, only to vanish without a trace. And now that stranger stood right in front of him, And with that encounter, the final act of a long-hidden war was about to begin. David Cole had changed. His once powerful frame had grown lean, but strong, like a man who had survived too many battles in the shadows. His hair had streaked with silver, his face etched with lines of time, hardship, and exile. Yet his eyes, still sharp, still unreadable, still holding secrets that no man should have to keep. Behind him, the cabin looked like a bunker frozen in time. Dusty shelves lined with maps of forgotten places, faded photographs pinned to the walls, stacks of declassified documents long hidden from the world. A man's entire history, hidden from the world that erased him. For a moment, neither man moved, neither spoke. Keanu's breath was steady, but his heart pounded like it knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then finally, in a voice that carried the weight of 4 lost decades, Keanu broke the silence. "I've been looking for you for 40 years. David didn't react at first. His grip on the door remained firm, his stance unmoving. But his eyes, they told another story. Recognition, calculation, and for the briefest of moments, regret. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David let out a slow breath, one that sounded more like a decision than a sigh. Then he stepped back. "Come in." Keanu exchanged a glance with Reyes, who gave the slightest nod. Then with a final breath, Keanu stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust and secrecy. Everywhere he looked, history whispered from the shadows. Yellowed news clippings, handwritten notes scrawled across the margins of classified reports, black and white photographs that told stories never meant to be told. And at the center of it all, a single locked metal box. David moved toward it, the wooden floor creaking beneath his steps. "If you came all this way, you might as well see the truth for yourself." Keanu took a slow step forward. His heartbeat was steady but strong. He reached out, unlatching the metal case. The hinges groaned, as if even the box itself knew the weight of what it held. Inside were classified documents, photographs of high-ranking officials shaking hands with people they shouldn't have been near. Names, transactions, betrayals. Keanu's hands tightened into fists. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice low. David's gaze didn't waver. "It's why they erased me." David took a slow step back, his shadow stretching across the cabin floor. "You want to know why I saved you that night, Keanu?" "It wasn't an accident." Keanu's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" David exhaled, then reached into the box, pulling out an old black and white photograph. He turned it toward Keanu, a man in a suit, expression cold, eyes empty, power radiating from every inch of the image. "This man, you ever seen him before?" Keanu's eyes narrowed. There was something familiar about the face, something distant, buried deep in the past. "He was there that night," David said. "He ordered the hit on you." Keanu felt his stomach twist. "Wait, Tomas." His voice was quiet but dangerous. David hesitated before answering. "Because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because you saw something you weren't supposed to see." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Reyes, silent until now, finally stepped forward. "What are you talking about? You're saying Keanu was targeted?" David gave a single, solemn nod. "I was investigating a powerful group, politicians, Hollywood elites, intelligence operatives. They weren't just running the industry, they were controlling it. Silencing threats before they ever had a chance to speak." His voice hardened. "And you, Keanu, you got too close without realizing it." Keanu's mind raced back to that night. The shadowy figures, the quick, deliberate movements. They weren't muggers, they weren't fans. They weren't looking for money. Then a voice cut through the silence. They were assassins, and they weren't trying to scare him. They were trying to eliminate him. David's voice lowered. "When I saw what was about to happen, I had a choice. I could let them do what they were sent to do, or I could break protocol and step in." David looked Keanu straight in the eyes. "I chose to save you." The room went completely still. For years, Keanu had assumed the man who saved him was some kind of rogue agent, a nameless hero who had helped by chance, but now, the truth was far more chilling. "They covered it up," Keanu said, more to himself than anyone. "They erased you because you interfered." David nodded. "I had a target on my back the second I broke rank. They didn't just erase me, they made sure I would dead to the world." Reyes's jaw tightened. He had spent years working inside the system. And now he was realizing just how much had been hidden from him. "Who was behind it?" Keanu asked. David picked up another document, a list of names all tied to undisclosed government projects. He pointed to the top name on the list. Keanu felt his breath catch. A Hollywood executive, a man still in power today. Keanu's expression darkened. "And you're telling me he's still covering this up?" David gave a slow nod. The people who did this never paid for it. They never lost their power. They just buried the past and moved on. Keanu stared down at the document. For years, he had been chasing ghosts, searching for a man he thought he had lost. Now, he had found something far more dangerous, the truth. David crossed his arms. If you walk away now, you stay safe. You get to go back to your life. Keanu met his gaze, unwavering. And if I don't? David smirked. Then you start a war you can't win. Reyes shook his head. No, not a war, a reckoning. Keanu exhaled sharply. He had spent his entire life playing heroes on screen. But this was real. We take this public, Keanu said, his voice firm. Then you'll need this. Inside the final pieces of evidence, Reyes let out a slow breath. Once we do this, there's no turning back. Keanu gripped the papers tightly. I don't want to turn back. David nodded. Then let's make history. And the world was about to learn a truth it was never supposed to know. For decades, they had buried the truth. They had erased names, wiped records, and silenced anyone who got too close. They had rewritten history, made sure that no one would ever know what happened. But now, that silence was about to be shattered. Keanu Reeves sat in the dimly lit cabin, his hands resting on the worn wooden table, his eyes locked on the scattered documents before him. These weren't just papers. These were secrets. Every name, every connection, every betrayal, everything the world wasn't supposed to see. And yet, here it was. David Cole's entire existence had been reduced to whispers, rumors, and fading memories. A ghost story in the shadows. And thus, the truth began its unstoppable march into the light. But now, for the first time in 40 years, he was about to step back into the light. And the people who had erased him, they would have to answer for what they did. Reyes leaned over the files, flipping through the pages with calculating eyes. He was a man who had spent his career dealing with secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. But even for him, this was different. Keanu could see it in the way his fingers tightened around the edges of the documents, the way his brow furrowed slightly as he read. Then, finally, Reyes looked up. We can't just go to the press with this, he said, his voice measured but firm. Not yet. These people have buried bigger scandals than this. We need to be careful. Keanu shook his head. No, we need to be loud. From across the room, David let out a quiet chuckle. You don't scare easy, do you? Keanu glanced up, his gaze sharp. I spent my whole life playing heroes in movies. Maybe it's time I actually became one. David studied him for a long moment before sighing deeply. You really want to go public? Keanu didn't hesitate. It's the only way. Reyes tapped the folder, his mind already calculating the risks, the consequences, the fallout. Then we have to move fast. Once they know we're onto them, they'll do whatever it takes to stop this from getting out. David nodded slowly. They already erased me once, if they find out I'm still alive. He trailed off, but the message was clear. Keanu met his gaze, unwavering. Then we don't give them the chance. Reyes stood up, his jaw tight. I'll call in some favors, trusted people in the press, but we need to be smart. If we're going to expose them, we have to do it in a way they can't control. Keanu's hands pressed against the table, the weight of decades of silence pressing down on his shoulders. Then his voice came out low, certain, absolute. Then we give them something they can't erase. 2 weeks later, the world changed. The conference room was packed. Cameras lined the walls, reporters filled every seat, and the low hum of whispered speculation filled the air. Keanu Reeves stood behind the podium, his presence commanding, but his expression unreadable. To the outside world, this was supposed to be another Hollywood announcement, a movie deal, a charity event, a new project. But what they got was the truth. Keanu took a deep breath, the weight of 4 decades of lies pressing against his chest. Then he spoke. For decades, a man named David Cole has been erased from history. The room went silent. Not because he was a criminal, not because he was a danger, but because he uncovered a truth that the most powerful people in this country didn't want you to know. A hush fell over the crowd. A few reporters leaned forward, their pens frozen over their notepads. Keanu's voice remained steady, firm, and unwavering. He risked his life to expose corruption at the highest levels, and for that, he was silenced. But today, that silence ends. Then he stepped, and David Cole, long thought dead, stepped forward. The room exploded into chaos. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted questions, voices overlapping in stunned disbelief. Keanu didn't need to say anything else, because now the world was watching history unfold. For the first time in 4 decades, David Cole wasn't a ghost anymore. The fallout was immediate, unstoppable. News stations ran the story nonstop, dissecting every detail of the cover-up. The names in David's files, exposed. The people who orchestrated his disappearance, under investigation. Hollywood's most powerful figures, scrambling to cover their tracks. But no matter what they did, they couldn't silence the truth anymore. Keanu Reeves had made sure of that. A month later, the world had changed. But for Keanu and David, it was only the beginning. They sat across from each other on a quiet balcony, looking out over the city. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, they had won a battle. David took a slow sip of coffee, his hands steady, but his expression unreadable. For a man who had spent 40 years in hiding, the world felt overwhelming. "You really did it," he muttered, shaking his head. "You actually brought me back from the dead." Keanu smirked. It was about time. David exhaled, setting down his cup. His gaze drifted over the skyline before turning back to Keanu. "You didn't have to do this, you know." Keanu leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You saved my life once, David. This was the least I could do." David studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Then with a small, knowing smile, he spoke. "Well then," he said quietly, "I guess we're even." The two men sat in silence, the city buzzing around them. The world finally knew the truth, and for the first time in a long time, David Cole was free. Days later, Keanu stood in front of a packed press conference. Cameras flashed. The world was watching. David Cole was erased from history for uncovering the truth. Today that ends. David stepped forward, his name finally restored, and with Keanu by his side, his story would never be forgotten. And with their courage and determination, the silence of the past was shattered forever.